Well, we're going to go ahead, David. I think we've got people joining on, and we'll sign a few people more on. But for sake of time, and especially for Scott's time there, I say we go ahead and get started. If you want to kick us off.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. And welcome to what I guess is our first TATT chat of the year. And welcome to, I guess, the first chat. Oh, getting some pretty good feedback here at my end. So I'm going to do a quick intro, and I'll probably turn it over real quick since I've got some bad feedback at my end. I don't know if you guys are hearing the same, but I am happy to welcome you guys to our first TATT chat. I am happy to be the one welcoming. I know Terrence is happy that I'm the one to do the welcoming this time as well. So I want to thank Terrence again for his 2 years year and a half at least of leading TATT chats, his 2 years of service as chair for 10 at the Top. Our guest speaker today is Scott Baer from Clemson University. He is the professor and department chair of economics. He gets to work in that shiny new building over there at Clemson's campus, and I have been in that, and that is just a beautiful building and a great setting. And we're grateful for you for spending a few moments with us and speaking to us about what you're seeing over at Clemson. And just want to turn it over to you for your remarks, Scott.
Okay, thank you. Again, thank you for the invitation to speak here. It's always great. I've enjoyed the last 2 times that I've been afforded the opportunity to speak to you all, and I am broadcasting live from the new building. It's slightly used. We wish it would be a little bit more used, but 2.5 years of COVID has kind of saved on some of the wear and tear. But I'm going to just go ahead and jump right into kind of the state of the economy talk. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and kind of go over what I see are some of the opportunities and challenges, I think, of what's coming up in the next year. And I think, as what has occurred at the start of the pandemic, I think the pandemic and the economy have been tied hand to hand in some sense. And so even so, there's some different things cropping up, economic news. It's still related, I think, to the overall pandemic and kind of the response to the pandemic. But as we've seen over, the last few weeks, our headlines have been filled with kind of both positive and negative numbers. Of course, the kind of dominant thing right now is the Omicron variant of COVID is surging. And again, that kind of has a tendency to slow down economic activity. On the positive ends, we see things like consumer spending is up and the unemployment rate is down to 3.9%. But on the other side, we read things such as unemployment numbers disappoint, GDP growth may be slowing, and then yesterday we saw that inflation has hit a 39-year high. So I think I'm going to try to hit on all of these things, or at least as best I can, at least touch on these things as we go through the talk today. So a quick thing to remind us is that really, unlike a lot of other things that have impacted the economy, this pandemic, and I guess it would be true of pandemics in general, has led to a different dynamic. And typically, economic variables in the economy has a fair amount of momentum that once it starts moving in a direction, has a tendency to move in that direction for some period of time before turning over and going in a different direction, whether that be positive or negative. With this pandemic, is what we've seen is the economy can turn tail as something new occurs, whether the numbers spike or vaccines are approved and people get vaccinated. The economy tends to move with these events, and these events seem to come up not necessarily out of the blue, but in some ways unexpectedly, and then have economic impact. So again, what I would forecast is kind of, going forward the next month or so, is Omicron is expected to blow through relatively quickly, but that still will have a slowing effect on the economy, especially in those areas like services where people are interacting one-to-one, or in some sense education as well, where we're slowing down the classroom opening. So again, Omicron's may take a little bit of a toll on the first quarter GDP this year. But that said, let's kind of go into what I'm going to hit on. I'm going to start with kind of an overview of income or gross domestic product and its components. And in doing so, I'm going to present what I think is a bigger picture, a longer term picture of what I think the last two presidents, President Trump and then President Biden, one of the long-term views of what they have. But then I'm going to dive in and talk about the pandemic, what's been supporting the economic recovery. In many ways, it's been quite dramatic in the sense of, back in April of 2020, we had employment near 15%. Now, unemployment near 15%. Now it's dipped all the way back down to 3.9%. No one really expected that fast of a turnaround. And GDP is mostly rebounded as well. I'm going to talk a little bit about labor markets and employment dynamics, what's going on with in the labor markets. I don't have all the answers for some of the things that we're observing, but I'll talk about a few of the hypotheses I think that's leading to why we're seeing some peculiar things in the labor market. And of course, as I mentioned at the outset, we saw inflation spiking, and I'll talk a little bit about how they're related to supply chain disruptions and supply chains, but also I'm going to stress that I think that may not be the main driver of what's causing inflation. Then I'll wrap things up. I have a couple extra slides in here to talk about debt and deficit and the infrastructure package, but I don't think in the 30 minutes that I have allotted to me, I'll get to all of those. So maybe at some other point, if any of these packages pass, I'll be happy to come back and discuss them in greater detail. But again, I'm going to zoom out at first, and I'm going to take a quick look at, again, gross domestic product or GDP over time. And if you remember from a macro class, if you ever had a macro class or some understanding of the economy, gross domestic product is both our measure of production, what gets produced within an economy in a year, and it's a measure of income, because if goods are being produced, the sale of that good has to be income for somebody. So GDP represents both a measure of production and a measure of income. And it's useful, I think, to look at GDP over time compared to what I'll refer to as its long run trend. So this red line here represents the trend line of GDP going into about the year 2000. So on average, each year from, say, 1947 up to the year 2000, GDP grew at about 3.3% a year. Beginning in around 2000, GDP, or maybe a little bit before, GDP growth started to slow down quite dramatically. You can see here we went into the recession. That was the Great Recession. And what was strange coming out of that was normally the economy rebounds pretty quickly coming out of a recession. It never really seemed to rebound quickly coming out of the Great Recession. And of course, here you see the pandemic. Well, again, how big is it? Why should we care about this slower economic growth? If you look to the difference between where we are currently and where we could be if we grew at a normal rate of 3.3%, again, the magic of compounding, we're at about 11% gap of where we should be. And if you look at that and say, if we could only be back to where we were, income per person in the United States would be about $5,000 higher. Again, that's per person. So in my household of 5, we would have an extra $60,000 this year. I know we sure could have used an extra $60,000. So again, I think one of the long-term things that both presidents have been trying to address is why GDP growth has been slower in the last, say, 2 decades than in the past. And again, here, this captures this pretty well. If you look at, this is the average growth rate of GDP per year in each of the decades, and you can see the fast growing 50s, 60s, 70s slowed down a little bit. We had inflation, had a couple oil crisis, but still it performed much better than it has over the last 2 decades. And in fact, you could argue, you might think, well, maybe it was just the Great Recession and the pandemic that caused that slower growth rate. But if you look at this chart here that looks at annual GDP growth every year from 1991 up until this year, you can see, yeah, we had bad years during the Great Recession, the pandemic, but in general, we kind of missed our mark in terms of reaching long-term growth. So I think both the Trump administration and the Biden administration have been concerned about long-term growth. Of course, President Trump approach to trying to deal with this was to lower taxes and cut regulation, whereas the Biden administration's goal or objective to do this was both physical infrastructure, social infrastructure, and building back better. I'm not going to comment on which I think is better. That's outside of the scope. But again, I think both of those plans we're trying to address, some long-term factors that have led to slower income growth in the U.S. economy. Now, to move on to talk about the economy and coming out of the pandemic, I'm going to start with this quick slide here. Hopefully, I only spend a second or so on it. This looks at the components of real GDP, and again, you could see, what percent of GDP goes to consumers, that's you and I with the purchase that we usually do, investment, that is the purchase of plants, machines, and equipment, government spending in terms of the services they buy, police, fire protection, education, as well as some of the services goods that they provide, like infrastructure, and then exports and imports. The one thing that I want you to notice here, the important thing is, consumption is about 67% of GDP. So consumption kind of is the main driver of GDP. And in fact, that has been the one thing that has helped us on the economic recovery. And so I'm going to talk a little bit now about consumption's role in helping pull income along coming out of the Great Recession. Excuse me, not the Great Recession, the pandemic. So again, if we look at real consumption here, again, I've drawn in a trend line just so you can see where we are around the trend. Again, like before, we fell below the trend line during the Great Recession. It kind of grew at the same rate as that long-term trend. Then we hit the pandemic, and the one thing that you'll note here, and I think you can see, is we're almost back up onto where we would have been if I would have drawn a line here. So consumption has been very quick to rebound. So while overall GDP is lower than what it would have been outside of the pandemic, consumption is about back to where it was before. And so what's accounting for that? Here's another quick way to do it. Look at it. This is, I put this data together from Opportunity Insights. And what this data does, it's highly correlated with that consumption measure I showed you before. But what this data does is it looks at national spending relative to what we were spending in early January of 2020. And you could see during the pandemic, national spending fell by about 30%. And then it slowly over time, it more or less has rebounded. And now consumers in the US are spending about 25% more than what they were spending back at the beginning of 2020. So again, this highlights that there was a big drop in consumption and a relatively fast turnaround. You could also do this, and I think this is interesting, and this is going to play throughout this talk. You can look at spending by income groups. And again, it follows the same path. High income consumers, their spending fell by more. Again, that shouldn't be too much of a surprise because higher income people had more discretionary income, and lower income people, right? You can think of they're buying more needs, more necessities. So it's unlikely that their consumption or their spending was going to fall by much. And middle income, as you would guess, would fall someplace in the middle. What I want to highlight next, and this is, I think it's key, and again, I'm going to talk about this probably throughout the slide at different points because it has important implications, not only about the recovery, but what might be happening down the road. Around April of 2020 is when the government first started to send out stimulus checks and increase and send out enhanced unemployment benefits. And if you look at that point where those checks started to go out, what do you see? You see a spike in spending by consumers, especially lower income consumers. This gave them additional money, additional funds to go out and increase their spending. We saw the exact same thing happened in December of 2020, right at the end of the Trump administration. And then again, we saw it in early March or mid-March of 2021 when the next round of stimulus checks went out. And again, the enhanced unemployment benefits kept. So again, the important thing is this government stimulus helped provide income and funds for individuals, in particular, probably helped the low-income individuals quite a bit and sustained their spending and kind of helped them buy to get through. What I'll argue and what I think I'll show is that this helped people at the time, but it may be having, I wouldn't say unintended consequences, but consequences that economists were a little bit concerned about as we look forward to what's going to happen in 21 and 22. If you look at South Carolina, the pattern of South Carolina spending is very similar. It took about a 30% drop at the beginning of the pandemic, and we're doing a little bit better on spending than the national average. Again, I think that's because our employment numbers had bounced back a little bit better. But again, what we're seeing in South Carolina is very similar to the national average. And again, what you also see is that response of consumers in South Carolina. When the stimulus checks went out, that led to a bounce up in consumption, and it seemed to stay at a higher level following that. And here's again another look at consumption through the lens of retail sales. Unlike the other charts that I've showed, that when we hit the Great Recession, we never seemed to bounce back. Here, we didn't seem to bounce back after the Great Recession. We hit the pandemic, retail sales dropped dramatically, and now afterwards it shot back up. It's one of the few series where we're above that long run trend. And so what's driving that? So we're about 11% above trend. What's driving that? The pandemic led to a real shift in consumer spending away from services. We weren't going to movies, we weren't going out to eat, we weren't going to concerts, and it shifted our consumption more to goods. And so that boosted a lot of the retail sales. And again, what I'm going to argue is that this pandemic induced shifting of consumption is also causing some of the issues, what may be issues coming down the road related to inflation and maybe related to some of the job search. So again, what we've seen is the consumers coming back, and especially in terms of buying goods relative to services. And again, this chart here highlights what's been going on. This is kind of the trend line of real disposable income, and this is what's occurred during the pandemic. And what's occurred during the pandemic, why has real disposable income gone up while national income has gone down? Because real disposable income also includes the transfer payments, which include the checks being sent out, the stimulus checks. Now it includes the additional checks that we're finding in our checking accounts for those who have children. It includes those enhanced unemployment benefits. So disposable income is actually higher, again, a little bit higher than it would have been before. And I'm going to come back and argue why this may be planting the seeds to inflation. If you look at this compared to what happened during the Great Recession, there was only one round of stimulus checks that occurred during the Great Recession. And so what we saw then, again, the real disposable income fell below trend. And so, again, we didn't quite have the consumption response. And one interesting thing about this is, what did people do with the stimulus checks? A lot of people, some people did go out and buy goods and buy services, but a lot of people either saved that money, so they haven't spent it yet, or they paid down debt. And for those people that haven't spent that money yet, again, that could be planting the seeds for something else. So again, the quick takeaway on the consumption side is consumption has rebounded rapidly coming out of the recession. The rebound in consumption has been supported by both the stimulus packages that were passed by the Trump and the Biden administration. And compared to before the pandemic, consumption has shifted more toward the consumption of goods and away from the consumption of service. This demand effect is causing some of the supply side disruptions. See, a lot of it is not necessarily supply, it's this increased demand, this enhanced demand that in a lot of terms in manufacturing, many firms can't adjust instantaneously to satisfy this increase in demand for goods and services. And this is leading some of the bottlenecks. So again, one thing I would like to stress, if you take one thing away, when we talk about supply chain disruptions, it's really not effects on the supply side, it's from the increased demand. And it talks some more about that. Investment. Remember, when we speak of investment, investment is the purchase of plants, machines, and equipment. And I'm not going to say much about investment because I want to quickly move on to talk about what's going on in unemployment and inflation. But investment is an important driver of GDP. It swings up and down much more than consumption. One thing I have concern going forward is as there continues to be uncertainty about the resolution of the pandemic and the next steps forward, uncertainty is going to cloud investment decisions. I wouldn't anticipate strong growth, even though the fourth quarter GDP investment is expected to be higher. But put yourself, and I'm sure many of you are in the position of, do I want to add capacity? Do I want to add space? Do I want to increase my production facilities? You just don't know until, you know, we come out of the other side of the pandemic, especially if you're in a more service-related sector. You're not going to add. You're going to be more reluctant to add space. So switching over to employment, we're going to talk, quickly about unemployment, employment growth, and employment by sector, and some of the issues associated with coming out of the pandemic. So again, the new numbers that came out Friday, I think in terms of the employment side, are encouraging. Unemployment is down to 3.9%, down from almost 15% that it reached in April of 2020. And if you remember, we were at 3.5% before the pandemic. And you can see, looking back historically, that this is the highest unemployment has been since the 70s. And once again, what you'll see here is the unemployment had more persistence than this shooting up like a rocket and falling back down quite quickly that we've observed. But again, the unemployment rate masks some important aspects of the economy because it measures both the number of people working and the number of people who don't have jobs but are looking for jobs. So there's a significant number of individuals, roughly 2.5 million people to 4 million, somewhere between 2.5 to 4 million people, who have dropped completely out of the labor force, and they're not contained in that unemployment number. So a different way to look at unemployment is to changes in non-farm payroll. And this is the other number that came out Friday. And I'm just going to spend a second. This looks at the changes in employment each month, and this is in thousands. So on average, from say 1990 to 2007, the average gain in employment in each month was about 131,000. So you can see here, the red areas are recessions, but on average, we average about 131,000 jobs added per month during normal times. In April of 2020, the U.S. economy lost more than 22 million jobs. Since that time, the economy has recovered almost 18.8 million of those jobs. And so we can see there are roughly 3.5 million jobs below where we were in February 2020. And so here has been the recovery in terms of where the job gains from beginning in roughly May of 2020 and taking us up to just last week's number, the reported December's number. Amazingly, in May and June of 2020, I think amazing to most economists and political commentators, we gained about 7.5 million jobs in those 2 months alone. But what you can see throughout this recovery is, even though sometimes we say the change in employment was below expectations, it was still above what the kind of the long run average is for good times. So last month, when we gained 199,000 jobs, it still was above what we would normally expect in good times. Again, we're trying to dig ourselves out of a hole, but yeah, the number was disappointing, but still it's kind of above the long run average. And I think that's that's an important thing to remember. If we look at the job losses in April and March and April of 2020, you can see the sectors that were most acutely impacted were sectors like leisure and hospitality, education, and health services and retail trade. Again, these were the industries, the service type industries where people are interacting face to face, one-on-one, and increase the likelihood of the spread. And so to make some comparison, I'm going to keep this in red. You can see this chart shows the gain in jobs in all of these industries coming back from since May of 2020 up through December of this year. So again, in say leisure and hospitality, though we lost 8,200,000 jobs, we got roughly 7 million jobs back. In education and health services, we lost almost 3 million. We have a little bit over 2 million back. And if you look across industries, you can see that in most industries, we got about 80 to 90% of the jobs back. But again, you could still see in those service industries that those are the industries that we still have a long way to go. So in roughly education and leisure and hospitality, we're still about 2 million jobs below normal. And that accounts for a lot of the not underperformance, but, the gains areas where we need to make the most inroads. So here's a chart that I think is interesting, and I didn't label it intentionally because I think this chart captures what we see, maybe you as an employer or as an employee or someone who just happens to be driving down the road or walking through, say, a business district. This line here represents job openings, and this green line here represents job hires. And so what we see is, and we've only been collecting numbers on this in this series since 2000. So I'm showing you the entirety of this series. And so what we see here is something that we have never seen before, is this big discrepancy between job openings and people taking jobs. And this is in some sense capturing this labor demand that seems not to be satisfied, and sometimes it's referred to as the Great Resignation, because you have all these firms that are looking to hire workers, but yet we're not filling up these jobs as quickly as we had hoped. Again, capturing a similar notion. This is capturing separations and hires. To quickly show this. So these are the job losses and the job gains. The blue line represent job gains. So again, what this shows is on average, we're hiring more than what people are being let go or people quitting. And so again, this is capturing, here you see the big job loss that occurred back in the beginning of the pandemic. And here's this increase in jobs coming back. Again, a little bit different way to show that. This also shows an important aspect, quits and layoffs. So, one thing that economists like are when we look at the employment is, most people don't like quitters, but economists have a tendency to like quitters, because we think when we're seeing lots of quits in the economy, that is a sign of a healthy economy, in the sense of you wouldn't quit your job unless you thought you had better opportunities elsewhere. So again, what we see here in terms of total separations, layoffs have been going down, but quits have been going up. And especially coming out of the pandemic, they've gone up dramatically, that people are much more willing to leave their job, and largely because there are more job openings out there. And I'm going to talk a little bit or say some things of why I think, or why economists think the quit rate has gone up so much. Skip this one in the sake of time. Again, looking at employment nationally, what I want to highlight here is that there is an uneven impact in some sense of the recession on different income levels. For high income workers, their employment outcomes have not been impacted much at all. High income workers typically can work from home, work remotely. And in some ways, some of the services they provide or the goods they provide have been increased demand. For low wage workers, they've been more acutely impacted. Think of those people who are working in the restaurant industry, or working at movie theaters or concert halls or venues like that. Those are the people who our employment is down still roughly 26%, not as bad as it was at the recession, but even going out through just a couple months ago, their employment outcomes haven't been as good, whereas middle income and high incomes have done a little bit better. If you look at South Carolina, again, a similar effect in South Carolina, where the middle income groups and higher income groups have performed better in terms of employment outcomes than lower wage workers. So again, kind of recapping, I think, some important aspects of what we see with these last couple charts, and summarizing what I think is going on in the labor market. One is, employment is still on the rebound, not rebound. There's still real challenges for employers to fill vacancies. And why is that? Why have workers been slow to come back? I think all of these things are true. I think it's going to take time for the data to come in and for us to analyze the data to get a better sense of what's driving things. One thing is that the extended or the continuation of unemployment benefits and the other stimulus payments have provided a source of income, and it becomes a disincentive for individuals to work. A different way to put it, if you have enhanced unemployment benefits, people who don't have a job are going to be more selective, looking for a better fit, and that's going to lead to higher levels of unemployment while they look for that fit. For a long time, and it's still the case, that parents with young children, the pandemic has impacted their ability to find jobs. And so again, that may be slowing down employment some. Another aspect is workers are reluctant to work in certain industries and occupations. They view those industries as, again, maybe potential health threats. In other cases, they may find the industries or occupations they were working, in aren't as attractive as they were before. Also, you have workers that are looking for different career opportunities related to switching occupations. Again, that they were working in one industry and now they want to move into something else. But one of the things that we've observed, so in looking at the employment data, and I was just taking a look at this a little bit today, is it's not all workers are switching. Say, I was working in the restaurant industry, now I want to find something else. Also, some people there's a lot of people who are staying within industries, but moving to different employers. And while we've seen increased wages, what we're seeing and what we're hearing when we talk to people who are making the switch, there are non-pecuniary benefits from jobs, as we all know, that are now leading people to resign and then look for different jobs. So yeah, they know they can get better pay, but with now the 10 million job openings out there, there's this increased desire to have work from home options when possible. People are looking for better working conditions. Another thing they report is they're looking for more recognition of their accomplishments, which always doesn't have to be in pay. So again, what I think with this increased demand for workers, it's encouraging people to leave one job and find another. And it's not always about pay. It's also about the quality of the work environment. But again, I think this list of things are some of the things that are driving the slow movement back to employment to the levels that we had pre-pandemic. So I'll conclude within the next couple minutes in talking about inflation. Of course, if you happened to catch the news yesterday, we saw that inflation had jumped up to 7.1%. That's the highest inflation has been since 1982, so 39 years. And again, what makes this a little bit different is back in 1982, we thought 7.1% inflation. For those who were around then, we thought that was a good number because inflation was on its way down from 14.6%. Now we're concerned about where inflation is going to. So what's driving inflation? So recently you've heard Elizabeth Warren and President Biden talk about firms, whether it's the meat packing industry or the meat producing industry, that it's profiteering and greed. Well, I think it's true that most industries are concerned about profits, and we may want to call them greedy. But to say or to think that this is what's driving inflation would have to make an argument that they're becoming more greedy or more able to capitalize on their greed during the recession. I don't think there's much evidence of that. So while profiteering and greed can lead to, say, higher prices, I don't think it can lead to continuing higher prices that we've seen over the last couple of years. I think there have also been supply chain disruptions. The supply chain disruptions have been driven by the pandemic, and it has impacted the ability to get parts and supplies as certain lines shut down. And as you probably are aware, if you can't get one part in, that may shut down your whole line and you're not able to produce. And that can have backup effects and impact things. Also, the labor shortages. It's just big. The labor shortages has led to a lot of firms increasing wages. Lots of firms run and lots of industries run on relatively thin margins, and they've had to raise their production costs, and then this has to push up prices in order to keep some type of viable profit margins. And again, the big thing I think that's been driving this is the increase in the demand. During the pandemic, there's been an increase in the demand for goods, again, shifting away for services. And for many goods, it's not easy to ramp up production. And so in the next couple of slides, I'm going to talk about what I think has been driving that. And that's been the fiscal and monetary response has provided lots of stimulus. And that's what I think is driving the inflation. I think it's going to be harder to slow that down. So here's a slide where I'm going to convince you, I think, that inflation is being driven. One of the main drivers, I should say, not the only driver, has been the stimulus package. This is money growth. And anyone who's studied Milton Friedman at all, this is the component of money that he looked at most. It's referred to as M2. Referred to as transactions money. This is money that you hold in your checking account. It's money that you hold in your savings account. It's money that you hold in your billfold or in your pocketbook. It's the money that you use to buy transactions. And if you look going back to 2000, the growth of M2 has been roughly constant, even during the Great Recession, where we talked about the big growth of the money supply. That was narrowly defined in one component called the monetary base. It didn't spill over into other aspects that we think about money being used for transactions. So over this period, transactions money grew about 6.1%. And then notice what happened here. You had this big jump up, and even now it's growing faster than what's before. And now think about, again, a story I will tell about why I think this is driving things. Where is this money coming from? In some sense, it's the classic version of Friedman's helicopter drop. You wake up one morning and you look at your checking account and you have additional, if you have kids, you'll wake up and you'll see you have additional money in your checking account. Well, what are you going to do with it? You don't necessarily want having that idle cash around, or you're out of balance in some sense. And so what you're going to do with that money is you're going to realign it to other places. In some, maybe you put it in savings, maybe you pay down debt, but a lot of people will go out and buy goods. And in fact, some people have gone out and buy goods. It's this increase in it. Then when you use that money to go out and buy goods, and remember, it's difficult for the supply of goods to expand quickly, that additional money chasing too few goods will lead to inflation. And so to give you a sense of that money growth, from January 2000 to March of 2020, that transaction money grew about 6.1% at an annual rate. Between April and June of 2020, that transactions money grew by about 50%. And then over the last year, more than the last year, that money stock has continued to grow at about 12%. And again, it's the idea of the federal government through these enhanced stimulus payments and the Federal Reserve working together that's led to this big increase in money. The key things here is the Fed does not necessarily control M2. That's you and I making decisions on how we allocate that money. what generally determines M2 is expected inflation. As I mentioned, this recent increase in M2 is something different. It's almost like the helicopter drops that Friedman talked about, where you wake up one morning and you're holding more money in your checking account than you had done before. And then there's this tendency to rebalance that either by stocks, which could drive up stock prices, or by goods, which is going to drive up goods and services prices. Generally, faster money growth is associated with higher inflation. I think that's what we're seeing. I think it's exacerbated by some of the supply side interruptions and some of the other factors that people have talked about. Maybe you could exploit these profit opportunities a little bit better. But I'm pretty sure that most of what's driving inflation is this increase in the money supply. And I'll skip this slide. So what would I expect in terms of over the next few years? It's reasonable to expect prices to continue to rise. A lot of the money that people have received in their checking account, they haven't spent yet. So once they start spending that money, that may lead to additional inflation. How the Fed is able to work their way out of it, and again, using an old term of take the punch bowl away before the party gets roaring too much, it will be a real trick. Again, one of the issues that you worry about with the Federal Reserve trying to take money out of the system is that they actually slow down economic activity and move us into a recession. Overall, I mean, I kind of end with kind of a negative thing, but remember where I started. The economy was recovering quite well. Consumption has bounced back. If we could remove some of this uncertainty, investment, I think we'll come back stronger as well. There's lots of positive sides on the labor market in terms of the recovery, but there's still a way to go, and we still need to understand what's driving things in the Great Resignation. The big thing, and again, it came out this morning, I think, of the Wall Street Journal where I read it, one of the biggest concerns that it's now up to number 2 is inflation this year, and can we get inflation under control? I think the Fed will probably have to act sooner rather than later. But I'll stop here and I will take any questions if you have questions. And again, I kind of sped things up and kind of stumbled over a few things. But as I mentioned, these slides will be made available to you if you want these slides. I hope you use them for good, not for evil at all. So thank you again.
Well, Scott, thank you. And we do have a couple of questions, and a number of them were specifically related to the unemployment. And I think you answered a lot of that, but I did have a couple that were asked. One is there a difference between the direct-to-consumer retail sales and the brick and mortar, especially given, that we've seen an increase, in the direct-to-consumer and people buying online? Where is that difference?
Yeah, I still think you've seen the stronger growth in the direct to consumer, and the brick and mortar have been slower to rebound to where they were. But I think, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, I think the brick and mortar stores have exceeded expectations of what the government thought and what most economists thought if you look back to where we were in April of 2020 or May of 2020. But again, the direct to consumer really has been, has been more important, has grown much faster, but the brick and mortar stores have held up pretty well. And I think you kind of see that when you shop downtown Greenville, or if you see people coming into your store in downtown Greenville, in the Greenville area, you see consumers back, maybe not in the same numbers as before, but they seem to be happy to be out shopping.
How about differences between where South Carolina is in any of the metrics and national? Is there any place where we're significantly better or significantly worse, or are we pretty much in line with most of the national numbers?
Yeah, we're trending along with the national numbers. We're a little bit ahead in most categories, but I think what I can't disentangle is if you look over the last 3 to 5 years before the pandemic, our growth and our numbers were looking better than national average because this looked like an attractive place to move to or to set up a business. So I think part of the reason why we look, again, following the same path as what's occurring nationally, but looking a little bit better, I think is just a continuation of South Carolina is a place where people will want to be in the longer run.
Perfect. And then the last question here I'll answer, or I'll ask you is from Jim Shue, where he asks about the universal basic income that was proposed by Andrew Yang and others. It sounds like that would hurt GDP growth and maybe add to the inflation. Is that right?
Yeah, well, with things, with things like that, the devil's always in the details, right? I think Milton Friedman, who may not agree, or Andrew Yang, who might not agree with Milton Friedman on lots of things, also favored basic the basic income. And again, it depends how it's introduced. If it's introduced as a substitute for other if it's introduced as a substitute, say for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and everybody just gets in, we get rid of the other entitlement programs, it would probably be less inflationary and maybe even less distortionary. So it may help GDP in that sense. But if it's in addition to all of those things, then it is likely that it will be more inflationary and may have more of a distortionary effect. So again, it depends on how you're packaging all the government services and entitlement programs with that basic income. If it's a complement to, likely to be inflationary and distortionary, substitute for, it has a better chance of being less inflationary and less distortionary, in my view.
Perfect. Well, again, we could go on and on. There's so much to untangle from the information. And Scott, we really appreciate your willingness to come on and share with us. And, I remember when we spoke when the pandemic was starting and your numbers and the explanations and stuff there were so good. But it's very interesting how, while the pandemic still is playing a role in what's happening, that the general, we didn't see that long-term dip because of what was done immediately after. So the recession is almost, or the pandemic is almost more of a secondary piece than the lead.
Well, again, I think it's really been amazing how quickly we reacted to the pandemic in terms of monetary and fiscal response, but also in terms on the health side. Who would have thought we would have had vaccines by the beginning of the next year, and other, and improved treatments as well. So I think, part of the economic recovery has also been due to the quick response by the pharmaceutical industry and the healthcare workers and the people in the health industry. That's mitigated some of the negative effects that could have been happening due to COVID health effects.
Absolutely. And again, thank you for being on with us. And I'm sure we will have you back on again as things continue to be confusing for the rest of us over time.
Yeah.
So
I hope the next talk is a variant-free talk.
Yeah, I hope so too. We need to get away from these variants and all the ups and downs of COVID. So with that, I have had a couple people message me about the slides, and just so you know, we always include the slides in our recap, or a link to the slides in the recap. So Scott has shared those with Justine, and we will. When we send the recap out tomorrow, it'll have a summary that you can download, from which you can download the slides. And of course, we also are videoing this, and we'll have it up on our YouTube channel. So Justine, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you for our resource updates.
All right, thank you all. I have to go jumpstart my car.
Thank you.
Like with the battery. Always something. Hey everybody, Justine Allen here. I have the honor of introducing our resource updates today, and it is it's National Mentoring Month, if you did not know. And we have a very robust upstate entrepreneur ecosystem. So we thought it would be nice to hear from a couple of those people about what mentoring they do and their organizations. Jeanette, I did not see Rhonda on, so I might be making an assumption that you are talking about Village Launch.
Yes.
All right, thank you. Jeanette Brewster with Village Launch will speak to us for a couple minutes, and then we'll hear from Larry Block of SCORE.
Hi, everyone. I am not Jeanette Brewster.
Oh, there you are. It is you, Rhonda. Okay.
It is me. I'm Rhonda Rawlings. Jeanette couldn't be here today, but I'm excited to be before you and always excited to talk about Village Launch. I'm not sure because this is my first meeting about how much you guys know about Village Launch, but it is an enterprise under Mill Village Ministries. And what we do is we exist to equip under-resourced entrepreneurs with, assisting them to get their business idea out through several ways. We have a Business Entrepreneur Academy, which is a 10-week workshop that they go through that teaches them everything from learning who your customer is to building a business plan. We have 3-week get started workshops for people who may not be sure if they're ready to take on the challenge of the 10-week program and they want to see what it's all about. We also offer a third Thursday market, which we just started this past spring at Po West, and that is for women and minority-owned entrepreneurs to be able to get out in front of the public, sell their items, build a clientele, and so much more. So it's all been extremely rewarding. And one of the things we do through our Business Entrepreneur Academy is our mentorship program. So our goal is to find one mentor per entrepreneur. And I read a quote recently, and I hope I can find it because it was really, really good. It says, "The greatest good you can do for another is not just to share your riches, but to reveal the riches that they have within themselves." So our mentors are really there. They come to every class. It's a 10-week class. They can miss up to 3 sessions, I believe, but they sit with the entrepreneurs. So they're listening to what is being learned along with the entrepreneur. So our mentors can, of course, share their expertise, be a listening ear for when the entrepreneur has ideas, maybe during the week when we're not in class. And we've had so many success stories with our mentors, most of whom tell us that it was as great an experience for them as it was for the entrepreneur who was going through the program. And they have been so great at pulling out ideas, because a lot of us know we may have been in business for a very long time, but someone else can see something that we don't see. And so, mentorship is just so important in that way. We had an entrepreneur who lives with, it's called lymphedema, I believe. If you've ever seen someone who suffers with really intense swelling of their feet or their ankles. And so one of our entrepreneurs has a shoe company that makes shoes for people who are living with that illness. And one of the mentors, I don't think it was her own mentor, but another mentor in the class actually was so impressed by her shoes that he knew someone who worked for a major shoe company and was able to introduce her to that person. And now I believe they're going to be, helping her with her, shoe brand. So it's just really, really important for us. Our classes are kept small, only, maximum 12 people. We believe that works best because we really get to know each entrepreneur and they don't get, as the saying goes, lost in the sauce. And so each mentor also gets to know each entrepreneur with a focus on their own. And so we had our first cohort for our 15th session, actually, that started last week. And we do have a mentor for each entrepreneur, but we are really constantly searching for people in the community that would be willing to give it their time and to join us as well. So definitely want to put the word out to all of you, and to, if you know of anyone that might be great, a great mentor for an up and coming entrepreneur, that would be absolutely incredible. And it's not, you don't have to own your own business, but just to give your, come in and just be the eyes and the ears, and express express your thoughts about what this entrepreneur is trying to do. It's just of the utmost of help. So we find that, this program, of course, it's helping entrepreneurs get their businesses off the ground, but it also is a really great way for them to increase their income and economic legacies for their own families. So it really is a great program, and we're seeing the benefits of it. So
Thank you so
for
much.
having me today.
Would you, if you would put contact information, who the best person to reach out to about that is, in the chat, everyone can utilize that. And you would probably have seen that Erica put a link to the article from Village Launch in our recent newsletters. So thanks so much, Rhonda. It's always nice to see you. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
And
Thank
next
you.
up, we have Mr. Larry Block with Service Corps of Retired Executives. Larry did an amazing sales presentation on how to be the best salesperson in the world to our upstate entrepreneur ecosystem recently. Larry, you are up. Thanks for joining us.
Hi. It's interesting that you called it Service Corps of Retired Executives. They don't call it that anymore.
Really?
No, it doesn't mean anything. SCORE, whenever I say that, people say, no, it doesn't mean that anymore. When I was in my corporate life, I remember guys retiring who were corporate. I was an international vice president of sales and marketing for Xerox, and I knew guys going out who were joining that, and I always had in my mind that someday I would do it. When I finally did it here, I found that more than half the people in it, number one, some of them aren't retired, and many of them are not former executives of corporations like I thought they would be. A lot of them are people who are or were small business owners. The other thing is, a lot of the people aren't retired. We have people as young as 23 in our chapter and as old as 82, and I won't tell you which one of them is 82, but you're looking at it. But anyway, we have about 50 members here. Not all of them are mentors. About 40 of them are mentors, and we work with, I don't know, hundreds, literally hundreds of people starting businesses, and some of them who are already in business. We also have people called subject matter experts, which I am the subject matter expert for this district, which, by the way, 10 at the top is kind of funny. We thought 10 at the top, some of us thought 10 at the top meant 10 people at the top of their game, like 30, and it turns out that it's 10 counties. Well, we have the same 10 plus one. I think we have McCormick County, and I don't think you have McCormick County, but we have the same counties. And mentors is a big deal for us. Getting mentors is critical. We've got an unbelievable number of clients, and we always have new people trying to come in. And we don't have any specific training program they go through. They line up with a mentor. Our mentors go through pretty rigid and stringent training, and then the people that join as clients, we try to line a mentor up for them that has the kind of skills that seem to be what they need, and they put them through a really rigorous bunch of stuff, creating a very simple business plan, and they work with them on funding, they work with them on legal aspects, they work with them on becoming an LLC if that's what they need. A lot of them don't really know what they want to do. We have people coming to SCORE that say, I want to start a business, and the person who lines them up says, what's the business? And they say, I don't know. And so others, of course, have an idea. A guy had an idea about pickled spicy green beans, because he makes spicy green beans, and he thought that he ought to go into the business. So the mentor went to a grocery store and photographed all the spicy green bean brands, and then went back to the guy and said, you sure you want to go in that business? The guy didn't go in that business. So we have a lot of that. And then the subject matter experts come in like I do. I co-mentor. I'm not, as I say, I'm not a mentor. I have no clients. I will come in and co-mentor wherever somebody needs a sales pitch, and basically use the same stuff that I did in that 1 hour seminar. I do 1 hour seminars. I do 5 hour seminars. I do all day boot camps in sales. So we've got people with various kinds of skills, and they will cross match each other, co-mentor with each other to help people get going. SCORE nationally has 10,000 volunteers, and last year 45,000 new businesses were started with 119,000 jobs. The interesting thing is more than 60% of the people now starting businesses are women, and 47% of the people starting businesses are minorities. Our chapter has no women mentors and no minority mentors, and we're trying like the devil to try to get people to join up. We have 2 programs. One is called Each One Reach One, where each mentor is trying to bring another mentor in, and the other is a speakers bureau, where we go around to groups like Rotary Club and Lions and stuff like that, talk about SCORE. Often we'll get clients out of those things, and sometimes we get mentors out of those things. But we absolutely need mentors, and anybody with any kind of real business experience, young or old, man or woman, glad to have everybody. That is our single biggest need here. There are other parts of the country where they actually have more mentors than they need, which I can't imagine that, because here we've got people coming every day who want a mentor. And of course, we find a way to get them. We have guys with dozens of clients. I think the average person has close to a dozen of clients. So that's what we're about. We're here in Greenville, and we have a nice office where people come for sessions with us and stuff like that. And of course, we have a big education program. My seminars are just one little part of them. We have how to use QuickBooks. We have how to set up a nonprofit. I mean, you think of it, we've got those kinds of seminars that we put on for people. Mostly
Excellent. Yeah,
okay.
Thank you so much. I went ahead and put the link to Piedmont SCORE in the chat, so people can reach out through that if they're interested in. And Lena's going to put the events link on our chat too. Thank you so much, Larry and Rhonda, for speaking today. And I'm going to throw it back to David.
Great. Thank you, Justine. And Dean, and if there's nothing more, I'll close this out. Does that sound good to you?
We're all good.
All right. Well, good. Well, again, I'll repeat what Justine said. Thank you to Rhonda and Larry for sharing with us. I know we're right up against the 4 o'clock hour, so thank you all for giving us your hour. The next TATT chat is February 11th, so we'll have the CEO of the Urban League there. Look forward to seeing everybody then, if not sooner. So have a great rest of the day, and watch out for that snow this weekend.
Hi, everyone.